Psalm 2 draws a really important contrast between two different types of kings. On the one hand, in the early verses, you have the kings who are taking their stand against God and against God's anointed one. They're plotting, they're deceiving, they're trying to use their strength to force God into defeat. In the same way that a lot of kings or a lot of governments, they use force to conquer other countries and to impose their will on their citizens. Sometimes it's one way of operating, by force. But then there's another king that's brought up later on in the psalm, where it says, God, who sees these kings, who sees them operating? He says, but I've installed my king, he says. I've installed my king on Zion, on my holy hill. And so he's talking about a different king. And while on the one hand, the other kings, the earthly kings, they take their stand with force, they try to force things to happen. And some of you might know that it's not just kings who can act that way. You can find that in pretty much any type of human relationship. People who want something from you and they try to use force to get it. People who want you to act a certain way and they try to use force to make that happen. That can hurt. Some of you are hurting. Because force isn't always an easy thing to take. That's one way of operating, with force. Do this or else I'll hurt you. But the king that God installed, God's king, he doesn't act that way. He said, I've installed my king on Zion, on my holy hill. Zion is another word that the Bible uses to identify Jerusalem. And there is a hill outside Jerusalem where we see our king. And what we see him doing tells us everything we need to know about him and why you never need to be afraid of him. We see him loving you by bleeding and dying and hurting by people who use their force to do those things to him. We see him carrying a weight that none of us can really see and none of us would ever be able to imagine. You know the weight on your heart when you realize you've committed a sin? When you realize you've hurt someone? Take that weight to multiply it by the number of people who have ever lived and by the number of sins they have all ever committed. And that's the weight that Jesus was carrying. Not his sins, but the whole world's. And he's doing it silently, because he only had one goal, and that was to forgive them. Not to hold them against you, not to shove them in your face, not to try to negotiate with you so that he could get something from you. He didn't use them as leverage. He forgave them. That's a good king. He's a king who loves with his heart and who wants you to feel comforted in your heart as you remember something else about that king. He's not only loving, he's more powerful than everything. Every king, every use of force, every sin. That's your king, the one God installed for you, who will never fail to rule with perfect love. Your king loves you. Rest well tonight, my friends.